This weekend, we've got a brand new Planet of the Apes film.
What a wonderful day!
So today I'm going to stop and rank all 10 Planet of the Apes films from the weird to a whole bunch of the best. When it comes to Planet of the Apes, this is one of the original movie franchises, right there with Godzilla and James Bond. And all along the way, they have been groundbreaking.
Ever hear of Planet of the Apes?
The movie or the planet?
Back in the 1960s, they were creating new techniques to be able to have the ape makeup, and they got a special Oscar for doing so. The more recent films were groundbreaking when it came to motion capture, as well as having photorealistic animals talking. The series throughout the decades has covered race, bigotry, religion, authoritarianism, man's inhumanity to man, legacy, as well as the cycle of violence.
By what right are you spilling blood?
By the slave's right to punish his persecutors.
Planet of the Apes also might be the original holistic multimedia franchise. It started out as a French book, it turned into a hit film, then it was a movie franchise, then it turned into a merchandising machine, and then they made it into 2 different TV shows in the 70s. That sort of thing is common now. But it was groundbreaking when it happened in the late 60s and early 70s. And let's get started. In last place, Beneath the Planet of the Apes. Simply put, this movie is just too weird for me, and I think it's too weird for this franchise. The basic plot line is about underground mutants who worship a nuclear bomb.
Wow, that was weird.
And who can use their mutant powers to project flames and other things in front of people. And none of this fits with anything else in the franchise, any of the other adaptations. This alone goes down this rabbit trail about mutants and superpowers, and for that reason, it doesn't really work for me. Now, the original film was a massive success, so the studio decided they wanted to do a sequel, but they didn't really have a story idea, and it just made for this very odd scenario where I don't think it really came together all that well. And because they needed to put Charlton in the film, but he didn't want to be in it, they have this scenario where he's like bookends the film and he's only in it for about 5 minutes. And then in the middle, they have this very contrived idea for how more astronauts arrive. And the guy looks an unusually large amount like Charlton Heston, which is just a little bit weird. And they also dramatically cut the budget on this film, so the makeup doesn't look nearly as good. There's definitely some bad ape masks in the background of a number of shots. Instead of having all of these wide open on location sequences, we're in these sound stages with matte paintings that don't look great in 4K or in Blu-ray or anything like that. And so a movie that for me is kind of the oddball of the franchise. They're trying to tackle some relevant themes in the 1960s about the fear of nuclear war and worshiping violence, it's just dated. It doesn't work. Number 9, Battle for the Planet of the Apes. And with this film, you can feel the franchise running out of steam and a studio desperately trying to make a little bit more money while being unwilling to spend money to make a product worth people buying tickets to. With each of the Planet of the Apes sequels, the studio had been cutting back the budgets. So you get to the 5th film where they want to make a movie that's about a battle for the Planet of the Apes. Sounds big, large scale, but with a much smaller budget, which really hurts this film. You can see the shrinking budget all throughout this film. Likewise, of all of the places to take this story, they decided to double down and give a backstory for the stupidest elements of the entire franchise, which I would say are the mutants from Beneath the Planet of the Apes. And we start diving into their backstory and where they came from, while also doing this plot line about the gorillas rebelling against Caesar. Really, this film as a whole feels very small scale. Feels more like Battle for a couple of trees in a school bus rather than Battle for the Planet of the Apes.
Not impressed. Conquest.
And they didn't have the budget to get a bunch of extras. And so you can very clearly tell that they're just doing these tight shots, reusing extras to try and make it look bigger than it actually was. The main plot here feels like 2 episodes of a Planet of the Apes TV show just strung together where, oh, Caesar wants to go learn about his parents. Oh, people followed them back. We're going to have a little bit of a battle. But there's just none of the dramatic stakes or consequences that you felt in any of the other films in this franchise. And so the movie that closed out the original run of films ended on very much a whimper rather than a bang. Planet of the Apes 2001, a shockingly generic take on Planet of the Apes from Tim Burton. Now, of the last 40 years, Tim Burton is one of the directors with one of the most distinct vibes and aesthetics to his films. Even when it comes to his characters, he likes to explore these misunderstood weirdos, whether that's his version of Batman, Pee Wee Herman, Edward Scissorhands, Willy Wonka. So back when we first heard he was going to do a Planet of the Apes film, many of us were like, what on earth is he going to bring to Planet of the Apes? What is that going to look like? What is it going to be like? And the movie we got is utterly devoid of any of Tim Burton's distinct style. All of the Tim Burton-isms are utterly missing from this film. This is the least Tim Burton film. This feels like a movie that anyone could have directed.
I'm very disappointed.
There's no distinct style, just a generic blockbuster with the Planet of the Apes concept from the early zeros. Now, on the positive side, the makeup here looks fantastic. Like, this is the peak of practical makeup. Pretty much everything else here is so bland. Even the look of it is bland. At the first section of it, when they're in the ape village, it just feels so much like we're on sound stages that it almost comes off like a play. It's almost shot all from one camera angle pointing into the set. All of the clever twists, social commentary, tragedy is replaced with blockbuster humor and generic spectacle. And so on the one hand, I mean, it's watchable enough, but there's just nothing interesting or memorable about this film except for the fact that Tim Burton made such a forgettable Planet of the Apes film.
And you blew it! You blew it!
In preparation for this ranking, not only did I rewatch all of the movies, I also tried to do a bunch of research into the franchise in general. First off, by reading J.W. Rinsler's The Making of Planet of the Apes. I love this guy's behind-the-scenes book. Also, the book Planet of the Apes, The Complete History. It covers the whole franchise, so details on the making of all of them, as well as some of the movies that didn't happen, like one that was going to star Arnold Schwarzenegger. And then there's the Behind the Planet of the Apes documentary from the late 90s. When I was in high school, my mom was in the hospital for 2 months, and it was right when this documentary first came out. And so I actually watched this documentary on loop back in the late 90s, and that was kind of my introduction to the Planet of the Apes franchise. And finally, Brandon Lee's The Crow is out on 4K. It has nothing to do with Planet of the Apes. It just happened to be on my desk at this moment. I have links for all those down below if you want to check any of them out. Number 7, Conquest of the Planet of the Apes. And to be perfectly clear, big gap between Tim Burton's remake and this film. The next 2 movies on this list I think are good. This film, like Battle for the Planet of the Apes, had a very limited budget compared to its ambitions. However, unlike Battle for the Planet of the Apes, I think this movie did a good job of stretching out its budget and making the film look bigger and more expensive than it actually was. Now, when it comes to Conquest of the Planet of the Apes, this is the movie that Rise of the Planet of the Apes heavily pulled from, telling the story of Caesar's rise to leadership and the revolt of the apes and their freedom, though telling that story in 2 very different ways. This one, of course, being set in the original continuity and intended to have very pointed commentary that was not remotely subtle.
By what right are you spilling blood?
By the slave's right to punish his persecutors.
In a very on-the-nose fashion, was calling to mind the imagery of the race protests, marches of the 1960s. And this is very much intended as allegorical storytelling where you know exactly what they're commenting on, but we're also telling this thrilling story about apes battling riot cops with machine guns. It's a big action spectacle, but also hopefully makes you rethink things, see things from a different perspective. Now, I mean, when it comes to this movie itself, I think there is a certain lack of sophistication in the storytelling, in the script. There's some big ideas that I think are far better explored in the trilogy of films from the last decade. I think it's a solid film with interesting ideas, but also a movie very much limited by its resources and the execution at the time. Number 6, Escape from the Planet of the Apes, the most totally uneven of the Apes films. It's still a good movie, but it's pretty wild how lighthearted the first part of this movie can be.
Well, why doesn't she take it?
Because I loathe bananas.
Zero.
And how dark and bleak it gets in the back half of the film. And some of that is kind of built into the nature of the film, where I think they wisely decided to essentially reverse the formula. Now, since they blew up the planet at the end of the last movie, they had limited number of options of what they could do here. And since they were dropping the budget with each film, reversing the formula and putting apes into modern times is a way to do something very different with the franchise, but that is true to what it's done before, but it also is much cheaper because you're in present times and you only need a handful of ape masks and ape makeup for the whole deal. And you're able to explore the ideas about bigotry, mankind's behavior from a very different perspective, and adding in some levity that hasn't always been inside of this franchise.
Does the other one talk?
Only when she lets me.
Now, in a lot of ways, this movie feels less grand and cinematic than the previous two films because it's set in modern times and a lot of office buildings. But at the same time, there's a lot of really clever ideas with the mythology, which are quite grand, in particular when they start building out this idea that essentially the timeline loops itself, which is cool, and not the sort of thing that you'd seen in movies prior to this. But of course, as you move into the back half and you get into some of those heavier themes of the franchise about our lack of trust, our destructive nature, of course, things start spiraling out of control into a very, very depressing final sequence. Number 5, Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes. To be perfectly clear, big gap from Escape from the Planet of the Apes to Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes. I love this movie. I thought it was great. It's going to be in my top 10 at the end of the year. But there's a lot of great Planet of the Apes movies. This current run, I think, is just fantastic. It is the most consistent blockbuster franchise that is currently running. Right off the bat, when they announced Wes Ball was going to be directing this film, I was nervous about that. I won't be nervous about Wes Ball directing movies moving forward. He did a fantastic job.
You did. You crazy son of a bitch, you did.
In the case of this movie, it's all about legacy. It's built so much on the events of the previous trilogy, but it's also very different from those films. And there's this neat way where the audience has more knowledge about the past than the characters in this film, but the characters in this film have more knowledge about the present timeline in the world of the film. So we are following those characters and discovering how each of these different groups interpret or misinterpret. We've seen objectively what Caesar did and what he said, and then we're experiencing hundreds of years later these subjective interpretations and the way that that has played out over time. While this movie lacks the emotional weight and stakes of the other three films in this run of movies, hence why it's in last place of this run, I think it replaces it with a solid sense of adventure. It's easier to consume, and we just explore and have fun in this kingdom of the Planet of the Apes. And it's able to end on a much more optimistic note than any of the other films in this entire franchise. Number 4, the original Planet of the Apes. And when doing rankings like this, it's always really difficult to rank side by side modern blockbusters with movies that are over 50 years old. In particular, a movie like Planet of the Apes, which was so culturally important. The ape makeup at the time it came out was unlike anything that had ever been seen before, and it got a special Oscar because of it. But over 50 years later, it looks very dated. The twist ending was shocking.
You maniacs! You blew it up!
But over 50 years later, it's just become so soaked into culture that its impact was lost decades ago.
Oh my God, I was wrong. It was Earth all along.
It's a movie that just tapped perfectly into that late 60s zeitgeist, the rebellious youth, all sorts of cultural ideas about religion, science, anti-authority, but that was all very relevant 10 years before even I was born, and I'm over 40 years old. Put all that together, you still have a movie that is highly effective, that has just a very iconic and memorable performance from Charlton Heston. Like, his acting style, his bravado is very much of its time.
It's a madhouse! A madhouse!
That's not the way that people act in big blockbusters now, but that's also what makes it pop so much all of these years later. It's probably not terribly surprising that the movie with one of the most shocking and celebrated twist endings of all time had its script worked on by Rod Serling, the creator of The Twilight Zone. And so there's just all these different ways in which this movie was so far ahead of its time, while also being very relevant to its time. It's still entertaining, but I think there's certain ways in which it is dated, and I think the movies of the last decade have a certain level of sophistication where they were able to build on top of the legacy of all of these films. Real quick before I go into my top 3, remember to join me down below in the comments section. Let me know your ranking of the Planet of the Apes films. Also, if you enjoy this type of video, I've done a ton of other sci-fi action franchise rankings in the past. All the big ones, I've probably already covered them. You can check them out somewhere over here when this video's over. Tied for runner-up, War for the Planet of the Apes, the film that closed out the Caesar trilogy absolutely perfectly. The movie is one part revenge film, one part prison break film, one part Spartacus, one part war film, all parts awesome. And it's able to create just this lingering sense of devastation, where all throughout the movie you just feel the utter consequences of violence and war. It's ugly, it's gross, and no one wins. Even as we watch Caesar, this character that we're rooting for, we want him to get his revenge, and also know that he's leaning into his worst characteristics. For me, Caesar is the best character of the last decade. And that's because what we saw in the previous two films establishing who he was. And while he is this inspiring figure that led his people to freedom, he's also a very broken character who can be deeply flawed and can make mistakes. He's got a temper. He has his ways in which he's like Koba, but he learns, he grows, he's always trying to be the better version of himself all throughout his journey. And there's so many incredible moments.
Leave him!
There's so many different moments throughout these 3 films that are so powerful. It's such an emotional performance that's so circus. It's such impeccable VFX. And the other key ingredient here, the fantastic score from Michael Giacchino, it manages in the midst of this bleak and haunting story to find all of these beautiful moments. And so much of that comes out from the score and the music and what he's able to pull out of the images.
Oh no! Okay.
This is a fantastic film. That's just how good this trilogy is, that you can make a movie this good. And for me, it's still not in number 1. But any of these 3 films in the Caesar trilogy could have ended up in number 1 for me. Also tied for runner-up, Rise of the Planet of the Apes. For me, this movie was the biggest surprise of the last decade. When the trailers came out, I had no interest in seeing the movie. Rented it when it came out on video just out of curiosity and instantly was blown away. It was not what I was expecting, and it was so much better and more emotionally satisfying than I could have even imagined. I think that this movie is just such an achievement, and it's a movie that plays very differently post-COVID. But what I think it does so well is it masterfully tells the self-contained origin story of Caesar that's resolved by the end of the film, but also sets up the sequel, sets up the Planet of the Apes, all in the background without that feeling like lingering threads. It feels appropriate to the movie that we're watching. It's a film that's able to be the triumphant origin story of Caesar. No! While also being the tragic downfall of mankind, side by side. You see Caesar as such this innocent child at the beginning and this powerful leader at the end of the film. And that's just the beginning of him as a leader. It does such a good job of establishing this journey we're about to go on with Caesar. And then you watch Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, where his legacy lingers on for hundreds of years. And you go back to his simple origins. The way that he was raised, those scenes are so much more powerful and potent in new and interesting ways. It's so pivotal. Those other ones only work because this movie worked.
So good.
But coming in at number 1, Dawn of the Planet of the Apes. One of the most emotionally devastating, morally complex, thematically rich blockbusters of all time. It almost feels like a glitch in the system that a movie like this was made, that is this gut-wrenching tale about prejudice, about the cycle of violence that lingers on such harrowing and dark emotions. It's a film where every time I watch it, even though I know where it's headed, my stomach is still turned in knots as the story unfolds, as you watch this complicated maze of characters, motivations, insecurities, all being pulled together. And you can imagine the scenario where it could have worked, but prejudice, our biases, our lack of trust destroyed all of it. And it's so difficult because those biases, the lack of trust, the desperation is fully understandable. Koba is filled with hate, but you understand why. Humans tortured him for years, and then humans make poor choices in the timeline of this narrative to validate his toxic perception of humans. And then Koba's toxic behavior validates the fears of all the humans. Most of the humans. And it's just devastating to watch it unfold. All in a movie where at one point in time, an ape riding horseback, dual wields machine guns, and battles a tank. You have Ape Foo in the third act of the film. And you have this journey of Caesar's death and resurrection where he becomes this mythological figure of sorts. All at the same time. When you can pull that off, you have done something special. That's what this movie has done. In a fantastic set of films, it's the top one. Dawn of the Planet of the Apes comes in at number 1. If you enjoyed this video, remember I've got more rankings just like this right over there. If you want to do that deep dive into the Planet of the Apes franchise, check out those resources down below in the comment section, or in the description. Thank you so much for watching, and keep talking movies and TV too much. Bye.